Leslie Scott was born and raised in Tanzania. And one of the games her family played when she was growing up was this block game. They would take blocks and they would see who could build the biggest tower before the tower fell over. I mean, they got into it so much they actually hired a professional carpenter to build blocks for them. So when she left Tanzania and she went to England, she got a job in a gaming company. She took the blocks with her. It was such a big part of her life. And when she met friends in England, she invited them over to her house and she taught them this game. And her friends loved the game. She would host dinner parties at their house and they're always wanting to play the block game. Let's play the block game. And because she was in the gaming industry, she began to think, I wonder if I could sell this game, if I could market it and make money. But she needed a good name. The block game just wasn't going to be real catchy. And so she reached back into her roots from Tanzania and she used the Swahili word for to build, which is the word Jenga. Very popular game. When it first came out, it was over 14 million games were sold the very first year that it came out. Do you know that not one of the Jenga blocks are the same? They're all slightly different in size and weight, and so that way every game is different. Now I'm sure you've played Jenga before. When it's your turn, you've got to take out one of the blocks from the lower level and put it on top of the tower, and without making the tower fall over, whoever makes it fall over is the one who loses the game. But have you ever played Jenga with that guy? That guy in the first round always goes after the bottom row and wants to take a block off the bottom. So for the rest of the game, the whole tower is shaky and foundation's not secure. Well, the game Jenga just illustrates a pretty basic point. Foundations are important. It's hard to build a tall tower that's going to be strong if the foundation is not firm and secure. Well, welcome to week 1 of Foundations, a Discipleship Community. We are inviting our church to have a 12-week-long conversation to think deeply about the foundations of our faith, to think deeply about God and who God is and the creation that He made and the kingdom that He is forming so that we can build a strong foundation for our faith so that we can build the strong tower of our life. Today we want to begin that conversation this week thinking about the idea of worldview. Now, if you're not familiar with this term of worldview is the way that we view the world. It's the lens through which we interpret and understand the world in which we live. And we all have a worldview. You may not have sat down and thought it out and written out your worldview, but we all have a way that we look at the world. And every worldview has to wrestle with these 5 basic questions. The 5 basic questions are, where did everything come from? How should I live? Why is everything so messed up and how does it get fixed? What makes life meaningful? And what happens after I die? And even if you don't consider yourself a philosopher or think deeply about life, you can't escape these 5 questions. Life demands us to answer those questions, and these are the foundational questions that form our worldview. And some people have a well thought out, coherent worldview, and others is pretty scattered and maybe illogical and just kind of reactionary to what happens. And it's important to have a well thought out worldview. So a good analogy is think about how different people handle money. Some of you have a very highly planned out worldview about money. You've got a budget. You've got short-term goals, you've got long-term goals, you've thought about your retirement and getting your kids through college and paying off the house. And so you're very particular about how you spend your money because you want to manage your money in a way that is consistent with all of your values. On the other end of the spectrum would be someone who just, they get paid on Friday and they cash their check and what do I want to do with it at that moment? And they, spend it all having a good time with their friends on a Friday night. But the problem with that is you've got other values in your life. You need to pay rent. Your kids want to have food. Other values that aren't going to be taken care of because you don't have a thought out plan about how we manage money. Worldview is like that as well. A lot of Americans do not have a well thought out worldview about life. And when those 5 questions come to call, It causes a lot of stress in their life. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's just take two different worldviews, the biblical worldview and the natural worldview. The natural worldview says that there's nothing outside of nature. Nature is all that there is. So if you can't run a scientific experiment, if you can't see it, if you can't touch it, it doesn't exist. Everything is in nature. It's the natural worldview. Whereas a biblical worldview looks at life and interprets life through the lens of Scripture. Let me show you the differences as you begin to answer these 5 questions, how they become interconnected and why it's important to have a well thought out, good grounded biblical worldview. So let's take that first question. Where did everything come from? Well, in a biblical worldview, where the answer to that question is that there is a creator. God is the one who created everything. God the Father, through the Son, created everything and is the sustainer of all things. And all things were created by Him and for Him. In a natural worldview, the way that question is answered is, where did everything come from? Well, it's through the lens of Darwinian evolutionary theory. So that there was a big bang many millions of years ago, and out of that big bang these elements began to evolve, and this evolving over time, modifications over time, those elements begin to evolve, they begin to interact. This primordial soup began to form life, and life began to evolve, and millions of years later, we have the diversification of the species that we have today. It's a purely natural way of answering that question. Now, there's some really good scientific questions to ask about that worldview. If you notice, that worldview doesn't really answer the question, where did everything come from? Because it doesn't explain where did the things that banged, where did that stuff come from? It doesn't really explain how out of an explosion, a chaotic explosion, came an ordered universe. For instance, if you saw that explosion in Beirut just a few days ago, the aftermath of that was just absolute chaos. It wasn't an ordered world after an explosion. It doesn't explain how life evolved from non-life. It doesn't explain how information of DNA was created from non-information. There's a lot of good scientific questions, but we won't go down that road. We'll just accept it that the natural explanation, natural worldview for where did everything come from is Darwinian evolutionary theory. So we begin to see how these 5 questions begin to build on themselves. So the second question is, how should I live? That's a question of ethics. It's a question of what is right and what is wrong. It is a question of how should I live my life? Well, the biblical worldview answers that question, that the creator and sustainer of all things is also the moral ruler of the universe, that God is the one who rules the universe that He created, and He is the one who has established how His creation should behave. So as the moral ruler of the universe, He's told us, don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery. We have these specific commandments that the moral ruler of the universe has told us this is how you should live. Well, when you get over here to the natural worldview, you begin to see how difficult it is to come up with a way that you should live. So Darwinian evolutionary theory says this has been evolution is random changes over time, modifications over time, not being guided by any kind of outside divine direction. It's purely natural process. It's purely random modifications over time. And so there's really nothing outside that says this is right and this is wrong. In fact, the driving process of evolutionary theory is that those that modify in the way that's strongest for themselves, those are the ones that survive, the survival of the fittest. And so really the driving ethic from Darwinian evolutionary theory is do what's best for you and what's going to help you to survive the most. Well, we all know that's a horrible ethic. It's a horrible ethic to say what is right is determined by what is best for you and forget about everyone else and take advantage of everyone else and whatever is going to help you to survive. But that question, we all have to answer that question. How should we live? And so what happens is as you're trying to build a tower upon this natural theory, we get to the second question, how should I live? And we realize that we can't really be consistent. We can't really be consistent to say the strongest survive. And so we begin to philosophize about how we should live. We begin to say things like evolution has taught us to think about not what is best for ourselves, but what is best as a group of people. But the problem is that's just a way that some people think. There's no real reason that we ought to think that way. And that's the big problem of a natural worldview is there's no moral ought. There's no reason you should behave in a certain way. And so you begin to see how this tower that you're building is not a strong foundation just from the logic of how you answer these questions. Well, we get to the third question. The third question is, why is everything so messed up and how does it get fixed? Well, biblical worldview explains the reason that everything is so messed up is because of sin, that the wages of sin is death, that God created us in His image, which means we are moral agents. He's given us a free will to choose whether we want to obey Him or disobey Him. And the scriptures tell us that we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And the result of sin, we've brought sin into creation. And all of creation now is in bondage to decay. Everything is messed up. Everything is broken. And the way that it's made right is through what Christ did for us on the cross. On the cross, dying for our sins, this is the way that we were made right with God. And ultimately, everything is going to be made right when Christ returns and makes all things new, and we get to live with Him in eternity. Now, all of these things that I just talked about, sin, Jesus, the cross, eternity, these are all things that we're going to think more deeply about in the weeks to come. But just real quickly, biblical worldview, why is everything so messed up? Because of sin. How is it made right? It's through the cross and through the second coming of Jesus. In a natural worldview, as you begin to ask the question, why is everything so messed up? What you realize at the very beginning is you really can't even ask the question. Because to say, why is everything so messed up, assumes that there is the right way that it should be, but it is different than what it should be. But remember, the way we answer the first question is it's a purely natural, random modification over time. There really is not a way it should be. So really from a natural worldview, you can't even say that things are messed up because we're just evolving over time. We're not headed any specific place because we're not being directed in any kind of way through evolution. The problem is we all know everything's messed up. I mean, if you have any awareness of the world around you, watch the news at all, it doesn't take much to know the world is messed up. But the question is, why? Why is it messed up? Well, through a purely natural worldview, you don't have a clear way of answering that question. So again, you begin to think about theories and how to fix it, but you don't have any solid foundation to base that upon. You don't have any consistent way of building upon the foundations of your faith. You're just grabbing for answers. Get to the fourth question. The fourth question is what makes life meaningful? This is a question of purpose. This is a question of what makes my life significant, joyful, meaningful, a question of purpose. So in the biblical worldview, the way that we understand purpose comes from, again, how we answer the first question. Because everything is created by Him, but also for Him. So the world exists for the glory of God. Now, that may strike you to say, well, I don't know what that means, or it sounds kind of like a boring way to live. All that's to say is, the question of meaning and purpose is really asking this: what's the most beautiful and delightful thing that you can pursue with your life that would give you the most joy? That's the question of purpose. Biblical worldview says the most beautiful and delightful thing in all of creation is God Himself. That there's nothing that you could pursue that's going to give you greater joy and delight than pursuing the beauty and greatness of the glory of God. Both making that known to other people, but also having a relationship with this beautiful and this great God. So our purpose comes from realizing the fact that we have been created by God, but for His pleasure. And that is where our joy and our meaning and our purpose is going to come from. When you get over to a natural worldview that says that creation really doesn't have a purpose, it's not really going anywhere, it's just random mutations over time, you get to this question of purpose, and you realize there is no purpose. There is no point. The world is not headed to an intentional end. There's no one directing it. And in fact, there's nothing larger than yourself to engage in. And this is where this worldview really, in our time, has led to a great deal of depression and anxiety. When you realize the consequence of this, it's very depressing. There's nothing really greater than me to invest my life in. On the outset, it seems very freeing, right? You can design your own purpose. You can choose your own purpose. But the reality is, once you realize there's nothing greater than this to live my life for, it is a very hopeless existence. And so you have to go after things. Again, this is why I say that it's important to have a coherent worldview, because when you get to the question of purpose, all that is built upon where did everything come from. When you get to the question of purpose over here, it can't be built on that. It's very disjointed, and we can't get a strong foundation. Well, we get to this last question. The last question, what happens after you die? Well, from a biblical worldview, we understand what happens after we die. Death is the separation of the body from the soul. If you're in Christ, if you're made right with God through the cross, your soul goes to be with God. And then when Christ returns, our resurrected bodies are raised immortal, imperishable, and then we live for eternity in this place called heaven, where Christ reigns in justice and holiness and in love. And again, those are things that we'll look at more in depth as we get throughout this journey. But from a natural worldview, what happens after you die? Well, again, if you're consistent with how we've answered the first question, when you die, you just die. That's it. There is no life after that at all. Well, that's an incredibly hopeless way to live. And so again, is another place where people try to step outside of the convictions of how they've answered these questions. And so this is where people suddenly, who have a very natural worldview, suddenly become very spiritual. And they talk about how we become angels, or how we have joined the great Godhead in the sky, or suddenly there's some way of thinking about reality outside of just a natural worldview, but it's not consistent with how should we live, or what makes life meaningful, or why is everything messed up and how is it made right. It's just a disjointed way of saying, well, this is going to happen after I die. And the problem is, when life breaks in and you have to answer these questions, you can either have a strong tower that's built on a stable foundation, or you have a very shaky tower because your foundation is not very strong. And so that's what we want to do through Foundations. We want to have a 12-week journey over thinking deeply about our faith. Who is God? What's God like? What's the world that He created? And what's the kingdom that He's forming? And we want to have a strong understanding about that. And so we're inviting our congregation to engage this on a variety of levels. You'll notice on this webpage there are next step resources. And so we invite you to read some of the articles there that we've linked you to. There's some videos to watch through Right Now Media, some next steps of how to continue to explore this idea. If you're watching this and engaging with this material as a family, you'll notice there's a companion video created by Sharon, our children's ministry. I encourage you to watch that as a family with your kids, and then have a conversation with your children wherever they are on their walk of life in a way that they can understand, but help them to begin to think about a biblical worldview. Well, next week, when we get to week 2 of Foundations, we're going to ask this question: how can we know anything about a God that we can't see? So I hope that you'll join us next week for week 2 of Foundations, a discipleship community.